On a smoke-stained afternoon in Kansas, a retired Army engineer named Walter Reed thought his wars had finally gone quiet. But when his old German shepherd, Rex, began barking at a rusted tank half buried in the weeds, Walter heard something no one should. An SOS beeping from a radio that hadn't worked in 20 years. Beneath the metal, he found a sealed box marked with the name of the company that had ruined his career and the lives of 23 men. What started as an echo from the past would pull him into a fire of truth, betrayal, and one final battle for honor. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments and let's see how far this story of loyalty and redemption travels. The Kansas plains stretched wide and hollow beneath a sky the color of gunmetal. The wind carried the scent of rust, oil, and sun-scorched grass, whispering through rows of derelict tanks and armored carriers that slept half-buried in the dirt. It was a graveyard of metal beasts, hulks that once thundered across deserts and battlefields, now reduced to skeletons of steel and memory. In the midst of that stillness stood a lone trailer, its aluminum skin dulled by years of dust and wind. That was home to Walter Reed, age 58, a man who looked as though he'd been carved from the same rusting steel that surrounded him. His shoulders were broad but stooped with time. His skin was tanned and lined, the kind of skin that had known both sun and sorrow. His hair, once dark, was now silver gray and trimmed short with army precision, while his beard, salt and pepper and uneven, shadowed a face that seemed permanently etched in contemplation. His eyes were gray, cold yet not lifeless, the eyes of a man who had seen too much, lost too much, and now found solace only in silence. Walter had once been a military engineer, meticulous, proud, and fiercely loyal. During the war, he was the man soldiers called the mechanic who could fix death itself. But after the Bridge 47 disaster, everything changed. 23 men had died when an explosive bridge component malfunctioned. One Walter had inspected himself. The report blamed negligent oversight. He'd spent 6 years denying it, replaying every bolt, every wire, every equation, until guilt became a permanent resident in his bones. The Army discharged him quietly, and the world moved on. Walter didn't. He retreated to this forgotten stretch of Kansas, a rusted horizon where time no longer demanded explanation. His only companion in this exile was Rex, a 10-year-old German shepherd with a thick coat of dark brown and black fur that shimmered bronze under the morning sun. One of Rex's ears was slightly torn from an old injury, and his right hind leg carried a faint limp that never healed properly after an accident years ago. His eyes, deep amber and intelligent, mirrored his master's weariness, yet there was still warmth in them, a gentleness that Walter had long lost for himself. Rex was more than a dog. He was Walter's witness, his shadow, and his only measure of time. The two shared a quiet rhythm: breakfast before sunrise, machine oil by noon, and silence by dusk. Every morning, Walter would sit on the small wooden step outside his trailer, coffee steaming in his scarred hands, staring at the skeletal silhouettes of tanks against the red horizon. Sometimes he spoke aloud, not to anyone, but to the wind. "They don't make 'em like that anymore," he would mutter, eyes fixed on the twisted metal hulks that once roared with fire. Rex would sit beside him, tail thumping once or twice, before lowering his head onto Walter's boot. That morning, the air felt heavier. The horizon burned orange, but the light was pale, as if the sun itself struggled to rise over this wasteland. Walter pulled on his faded army jacket, its fabric worn thin at the elbows, and began his usual inspection rounds. He had built a small workshop beside his trailer. a makeshift lab filled with parts scavenged from the boneyard. Engines half repaired, toolboxes lined in perfect order, a blackboard covered in equations only he understood. "Come on, boy," Walter said, patting his thigh. Rex rose with a grunt and followed, nails clicking against the concrete floor. The sound was comforting, steady, loyal, like an echo of a heartbeat that hadn't stopped yet. The wind cut sharper as they moved among the rusting hulks. Each vehicle bore a scar of its own, bullet holes, faded insignia, graffiti left by forgotten hands. Walter ran his gloved fingers along a tank's hull, reading its history through touch. "You remember this one, don't you?" he murmured to Rex. "Desert Storm? She came back broken, just like the rest of us." Rex barked softly, as if agreeing. The dog's breath hung in the cold air like smoke. By midday, Walter was knee-deep in the guts of an old engine, wrench in hand, humming an old Johnny Cash tune under his breath. Rex lay nearby on a patch of sun-warmed dirt, tail twitching whenever Walter spoke. Every so often, the man would glance up from his work, gaze drifting toward the endless plains that shimmered under the heat. "You'd think the world would forget a place like this," he said, tightening a bolt. "But it remembers, don't it? Every piece of metal here has a story, and every story's got blood on it." He paused, wiped the sweat from his brow with a rag. "So do I." In the distance, a train wailed faintly, its echo fading like a ghost's sigh. Rex lifted his head, ears perked, then settled again. Walter stared out toward the sound until it was gone, then bent back to his work. Evening arrived quietly. The Kansas sky bled into shades of copper and violet, the air cooling fast. Walter stood at the edge of the boneyard, watching the last light of day cling to the rusted edges of the tanks. It was a kind of beauty that only decay could offer. Soft, tragic, and unspoken. Rex pressed his body against Walter's leg, seeking warmth. "Not much left for us, huh, boy?" Walter whispered, his voice rough but gentle. He reached down, scratching behind Rex's ear. The dog's tail flicked once. "Just you, me, and a field full of ghosts." As the wind howled across the plains, the man and the dog turned back toward the faint light of the trailer. Behind them, the shadows of the tanks stretched long and dark, like the fingers of history refusing to let go. The rusted horizon glowed faintly under the first stars, and in that fragile light, the silence of Kansas felt like absolute. The afternoon sun sank low over the Kansas plains, bleeding into the rusted hulls of the old war machines and coating them in a dull orange glow. Walter Reed wiped the sweat from his forehead with a grease-stained rag, crouched over the disassembled engine of an armored jeep. The smell of oil and rust clung to him like a second skin. Around him, the boneyard hummed softly with the buzz of flies and the moan of wind through twisted steel. Rex, his loyal German shepherd, lay a few yards away in the shade of a gutted tank, head resting on his paws but eyes alert, scanning the field with quiet vigilance. The day had been long, the kind that blurred time into a haze of metal and memory. Walter muttered to himself as he sorted through a pile of spare parts, his voice low and steady. "Fuel valve, torque wrench. Come on, you old bastard, where did you go?" His fingers brushed over a corroded chain, a few copper fittings, then landed on something smooth, plastic, not metal. He frowned, pulling out a cracked walkie-talkie, military issue, its casing burnt and half melted. He smirked. "Relics of the forgotten," he said under his breath and tossed it aside. But the second it hit the ground, Rex shot up, barking sharply, his fur bristling along his back. "Easy, boy," Walter said, startled, watching as the dog darted toward a nearby armored vehicle, one of the old troop carriers that had sat there untouched for decades. The dog circled it, barking in short, anxious bursts, then began pawing at the dirt near its wheel. Walter stood slowly, the wrench still in his hand, and followed. "What the hell's gotten into you?" he muttered. The air seemed to shift, quieter, heavier. When he reached the vehicle, he froze. From inside the rusted steel shell came a faint, stuttering sound. 3 short bursts, 3 long, 3 short. An SOS. His breath caught in his throat. It was impossible. The vehicle hadn't moved in years. No battery could survive that long. He pressed his ear against the side panel. The metal was cool, vibrating slightly. The sound came again, clearer this time, echoing through the hollow interior. Rex barked louder, pacing, tail stiff. All right, Walter muttered, forcing his hands to steady. "Let's see what ghost you've dug up." He grabbed a crowbar from the Jeep and wedged it into the panel. The old bolts resisted, groaning like something alive before snapping loose. The door creaked open, spilling out a gust of dry, hot air that smelled of earth and oxidized metal. Inside was darkness and dust. He shone his flashlight in, the beam cutting through floating motes of rust. There, tangled among broken wires and rotted canvas seats, lay a small metal box, about the size of a lunch tin. It was sealed with a latch engraved faintly with a name he hadn't heard in years: Harrison Defense Corporation. His stomach tightened. That was the same contractor that supplied components for the Bridge 47 project, the one that had collapsed, ending 23 lives and destroying his career. "No," he whispered, reaching for it with gloved hands. The box was cold, heavier than expected, and when he lifted it, the SOS pulse stopped. The silence that followed was thick, almost sentient. Rex whimpered softly, ears flattened, as if sensing something Walter could not. The man stared at the box, its surface scarred with time, but the company's logo still clear. A circle split by a lightning bolt. The edges were fused with grime and what looked like traces of solder, as though someone had tried to seal it permanently. Walter carried it out into the open air, squinting against the fading light. He set it on the hood of his Jeep and tapped it with his wrench. Hollow. He pulled at the latch. It didn't budge. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured. "You shouldn't even exist anymore." He thought of the investigation years ago, how Harrison had quietly pulled all their models after the collapse, claiming a supply flaw. He'd testified that he had followed every safety protocol, but it hadn't mattered. They needed a scapegoat, and he'd been the easiest to burn. Now here it was. A ghost from the same company, hidden in the belly of a forgotten tank. He looked down at Rex, whose amber eyes gleamed with reflected light. "You found something big, didn't you, old man?" Rex gave a low bark, tail wagging once before curling beside him. Walter exhaled and leaned against the Jeep, rubbing the back of his neck. The sun was dipping fast, the horizon bleeding crimson. He knew he should wait till morning, but his mind was already racing. Schematics, codes, protocols. He hadn't felt this alive in years. He ran his thumb along the edge of the box, feeling the faint vibration under the metal, like a heartbeat. The same rhythm he'd heard from the bridge before it fell. He froze, staring at it again, the wind howling across the field. "You're not done with me yet, are you?" he whispered. The dog raised its head, ears twitching towards the sound of the wind. Somewhere out in the distance, a lone crow screamed, its cry fading into the dusk. Walter placed the box inside his satchel, closed the flap, and started the walk back to the trailer. Each step echoed against the silent field, heavy and deliberate, as though the earth itself was listening. The night came early that day, dragging a veil of gray over the Kansas plains. The wind had died, leaving behind a silence so deep that even the insects seemed to have forgotten how to move. Walter Reed sat at his workbench, the single bulb above him flickering faintly, casting long shadows across the walls lined with tools and maps. The metal box lay in front of him, resting on a torn army blanket like an artifact from another world. Its dull surface reflected the light in trembling fragments. Walter leaned in, the creases around his eyes tightening as he examined the latch. "You're not just a box," he muttered, voice low and gravelly. "You're a confession." Rex lay nearby, chin resting on his paws, amber eyes never leaving his master. The old dog's ears twitched at every small metallic click. Walter picked up a pair of pliers and gently tried to pry the seal open. It didn't move. He tried again, harder this time. The metal creaked, resisting him like something that didn't want to be remembered. Finally, with a groan, the latch gave way. The lid opened slowly, exhaling a puff of stale air mixed with the acrid tang of burned circuits. Inside was a bundle of corroded wires, fragments of capacitors, and what looked like the remains of a transmitter board, blackened at the edges, still faintly smelling of ozone. Among the fragments lay a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle with time. Walter lifted it carefully, his fingers trembling. On it, in faded ink, were the words Batch 45A, Bridge Support Model. His pulse quickened. That number, 45A, was seared into his memory like a brand. It was the same series used in the Bridge 47 structure, the one that had collapsed 10 years ago. The same model he'd been accused of authorizing despite his repeated warnings that the components had been tampered with. For a long moment he couldn't move. The ghosts he'd buried clawed their way back to the surface. He could almost hear the bridge screaming again, the roar of metal giving way, the shouts over the radio that dissolved into static. "No," he whispered. "It can't be." Rex whined softly, sensing his master's unease. Walter set the paper down, took a deep breath, and turned to his shelf. He pulled down an old walkie-talkie, one of his own, dead for years. He hooked the wires from the box into the device, half out of habit, half curiosity. The power light didn't turn on. He frowned, adjusted the knobs, hit the casing once with his palm. Then, suddenly, the walkie crackled to life. A burst of static filled the air, sharp and dry, like old bones rubbing together. Walter froze. A voice emerged, weak, distorted, but human. "If you're hearing this," it said, the words trembling through the static, "they're still using them." The workshop fell silent again. Walter stared at the device, his mouth slightly open, breath shallow. He looked at Rex, who was now on his feet, ears perked, tail stiff. "Did you hear that?" Walter whispered, though he already knew the answer. The voice had been real. He rewound the tape, but when he pressed play, only static returned. No voice, no signal, just the empty hiss of old electricity. Walter leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. His heart pounded against his ribs, not from fear, but from the surge of clarity that came with it. Someone had left that message on purpose. Someone knew about 45A, and someone wanted it to be found. He reached for a small notebook and scribbled the message. "If you're hearing this, they're still using them." Beneath it, he drew the Harrison Defense logo from memory. Then he added a single word. "Why?" The light above him flickered again, dimming as the wind picked up outside, rattling the thin walls of the trailer. Rex barked once, sharp and short. Walter turned off the lamp and listened. The field beyond was quiet, but he could feel something in that silence, an awareness, like the land itself was holding its breath. He placed the folded note back inside the box and slid it under the workbench. The walkie-talkie he left on, though it now hummed with nothing but static. He poured himself a shot of whiskey from the dusty bottle by the window and drank it in one go, the burn cutting through the chill. "Looks like we're not done yet, boy," he said quietly. Rex wagged his tail once, then laid down beside him. Walter stared out into the black horizon, where the skeletons of old tanks glimmered under the rising moon. The field that had buried his past was whispering again, and this time it was calling him back. The next morning broke under a sky the color of iron. Kansas lay silent, windless, the horizon trembling in the pale heat. Walter Reed sat behind the wheel of his pickup truck, the metal box buckled into the passenger seat beside Rex, who panted softly in the still air. Walter's jaw was tight as he drove east toward Wichita. The highway stretched endless and empty, like a scar across the land. His hands gripped the wheel with the same force he used to hold on to sanity. The night's echo of that voice, they're still using them, refused to leave his mind. The GPS on his cracked phone blinked a name that felt both strange and familiar. Maria Alvarez. She had been a junior inspector at Harrison Defense back when the Bridge 47 investigation started. A woman known for refusing to sign the clearance reports after the recall. She had vanished from the corporate world shortly after, labeled unstable in the company memos. Walter remembered the whisper among the engineers. She knew too much. By late morning, he reached the outskirts of Wichita, a cluster of warehouses and fading billboards. He found her address at the end of a quiet industrial street. The house was modest, its paint chipped by sun and time. A faded blue mailbox read, M. Alvarez. He parked outside, grabbed the metal box, and approached. Rex stayed close, his tail low but alert. When the door opened, the woman who stood before him was not what he expected. Maria Alvarez, around 40, was tall and slender, with olive skin and sharp cheekbones that cast deliberate shadows when she turned her face to the light. Her hair, a dark brown streaked with gray, was tied back in a rough bun, and her eyes, dark hazel, steady and penetrating, carried the quiet weight of someone who'd seen truth break apart lives. She wore a white button-up shirt with rolled sleeves and jeans stained with oil. There was no makeup, no softness in her manner, just clarity and a certain exhaustion that mirrored Walter's own. "I was wondering when someone from the graveyard would show up," she said flatly, crossing her arms. Walter hesitated. "You know who I am?" "Walter Reed," she replied, as if reading from a report. "The scapegoat of Bridge 47. They made sure your name was the headline, not theirs." Her tone was sharp, but not unkind. She stepped aside. "Come in. You brought something, didn't you?" Inside, her home was half laboratory, half archive. Tables were stacked with old circuit boards, file boxes labeled Harrison 2009, internal reports, and bridge specs. The faint hum of soldering equipment filled the air. She gestured to a chair, and Walter sat, placing the box between them. Rex settled near his feet, eyes darting between the two humans, as if understanding the gravity in the room. "Where did you find this?" Maria asked, her voice low now. "Inside an old armored vehicle out in my yard," Walter said. "It was transmitting an SOS. Inside, fragments, a note with Batch 45A. Maria froze for a second, then exhaled sharply. 45 Alpha, she repeated, rubbing her temples. God, they were supposed to destroy that line. I told them it wasn't fit for combat use. Half the circuits were made with counterfeit materials, restamped under subcontractors from Asia. She walked to a filing cabinet, rifled through a drawer, and pulled out a thin folder. "Here," she said, tossing it on the table. Inside were photos, blown bridges, ruptured casings, documents stamped classified. One page bore the Harrison Defense seal and a signature block that read, M. Alvarez, Engineering Compliance. They fired me a week after I signed that, she said bitterly. I told the Department of Defense their training devices were using recycled explosive triggers from combat contracts. They told me to take a vacation. Then someone broke into my office. Walter stared at the photos, his jaw clenching. They sold recycled detonators under new serials. Maria nodded. Through shell companies, Revere Logistics, Northway Equipment, all under Harrison's umbrella. They called it cost recovery. I called it a death sentence. Walter leaned back, his eyes darkening. So the bridge wasn't my fault. Maria looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and grim certainty. No, you just happened to be standing where their lies collapsed. Silence hung between them. Outside, a train passed, its low rumble shaking the window panes. Finally, Walter spoke. They're still out there, he said. Someone sent that message. Someone wanted me to find this. Maria studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. Then they're afraid. And that's something we can use. She sat across from him, tapping her finger on the metal box. You've got field experience, Reed. I've got documentation, internal emails, prototypes. If we put this together, we might actually expose them. Walter gave a dry chuckle. Expose Harrison Defense? That's like punching a tank. Then we'll aim for the fuel line, Maria said calmly. Her lips curved into the faintest smirk. You in? Walter glanced down at Rex, who gave a small bark, as if answering for him. He met Maria's gaze, steady and cold. I'm in. The hum of the soldering iron filled the silence, like a prelude to something long overdue. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, rolling across the Kansas plains like the growl of something ancient waking from sleep. The night wrapped Wichita in a sheet of cold steel. Clouds hung low, smothering the moon, and the city's edge, where the industrial district began, was little more than a maze of dead factories and storage lots. The old Harrison Defense Warehouse sat on the far side of a rail line, its sign faded, its windows blacked out, a rusted fence curling like barbed ivy around its perimeter. Walter Reed parked his truck 2 blocks away, engine off, lights dimmed. Inside, Rex waited in the passenger seat, ears pricked, tail motionless. The German Shepherd's silhouette was steady, eyes glowing faintly amber under the dashboard light. Beside Walter, Maria Alvarez checked the contents of her worn leather satchel, flashlight, camera, data stick, and a pair of thin gloves. Her face, pale in the glow of the screen, was calm but taut, jaw clenched like she was bracing herself for something she'd already survived once before. She looked at Walter. You sure you're up for this? He smirked without humor. I've been waiting 10 years to walk back into hell. Let's go. They moved on foot, silent as shadows, the gravel crunching beneath their boots in careful rhythm. Walter wore his old army jacket again, its elbows patched with duct tape. Maria was dressed in black, jeans, jacket, hair tied tight behind her head. Rex trotted close, occasionally sniffing the air. The fence was easy. Walter cut through a section with bolt cutters, the metal groaning softly. The moment they slipped inside, the air changed. Thicker, tinged with the smell of chemical dust and oil. They still maintain power here, Maria whispered, pointing toward a single red light blinking above a door. Backup generator. They never let their ghosts sleep. Walter gave a small nod. Then let's wake them. They found a side entrance, its lock rusted but still firm. Walter wedged his crowbar beneath the latch and pressed until it snapped. Inside was darkness, a stale, heavy kind that felt alive. Maria turned on her flashlight, and the beam revealed rows upon rows of metal crates, stacked to the ceiling. Each was marked with white stencil paint, RVR logistics, training equipment. But as the light swept over them, Walter's sharp eyes caught something else. Where the paint had chipped, old numbers peeked through. 45A 721, 45A 738, 45A 740. The same cursed series that had haunted his nightmares. Jesus, he murmured. Maria raised her camera, snapping photos in quick bursts. They rebranded the same hardware, she said, voice trembling but precise. Different labels, same death traps. Walter pried open one of the crates. Inside were circuit modules, wiring boards, and signal devices, all wrapped neatly in new plastic, each bearing the fresh logo of Revere Systems, one of Harrison's fake subsidiaries. He took a piece in his hand, turned it under the light, and saw a faint burn mark along the seam. The same structural flaw that had caused the bridge, detonators to fail. They didn't fix anything, he said, voice low, heavy. They just painted over it. Maria crouched beside another crate, connecting a portable drive to the nearby security terminal. Her fingers moved fast, downloading data from the old system. The blue light flickered across her face, making her look carved from glass and nerve. I can get the inventory logs, she said. If I can find where these were shipped, we can prove... A sharp click cut through her words. Both froze. A red light blinked above the door, then another across the ceiling. Motion sensors, Walter hissed. Move! The warehouse exploded with sound, a blaring siren, red strobes flashing like lightning. Rex barked furiously as Walter slammed the crate lid shut and grabbed Maria's arm. This way! They ran between the aisles, boots slapping concrete, the echo of alarm bells chasing them. A mechanical voice shouted, "Security breach detected," from somewhere above. Maria sprinted toward the far end of the room, where a narrow door glowed with green light. Emergency exit! Go! Walter shoved Rex ahead and covered their rear. A metallic bang split the air. One of the suspended crates had come loose from the vibration. Walter dove aside just as it crashed down, metal splintering, a shard tearing through his shoulder. Pain flared bright and hot. He gritted his teeth but kept moving. Go! He yelled through clenched jaw. Maria burst through the side door, pulling Rex with her. Walter stumbled after them, clutching his bleeding shoulder. They spilled into the alley behind the warehouse, gasping in the night air. The siren still screamed inside, but no one had yet appeared. You're hit, Maria said, kneeling beside him, pressing her scarf against the wound. Walter waved her off. Just a scratch. She gave him a look that said she didn't believe it, but didn't argue. Rex whined softly, licking Walter's hand. We got what we came for, she said, holding up the drive. The tiny blue light blinked steadily. Everything's in here. Walter looked back at the warehouse, red lights flashing through its broken windows, and exhaled. Then it was worth it. They staggered toward the truck, shadows melting back into the industrial dark. Behind them, the sirens wailed on, an angry chorus over a graveyard of lies. The rain began before dawn, soft at first, then relentless, a steady rhythm tapping against the tin roof of Walter Reed's trailer. The air smelled of wet dust and rust, and the wind carried the metallic scent of the boneyard through the cracked window. Walter sat hunched over his workbench, shoulder bandaged tightly, blood seeping faintly through the gauze. His fingers moved across the keyboard with mechanical precision, the glow of multiple monitors painting his weathered face in shades of cold blue. Every click, every command was deliberate. He was building something that might outlive him. Dead man's switch, he muttered under his breath, the term rolling off his tongue like an old curse. The program would activate if he failed to log in within 24 hours, automatically sending every piece of evidence he and Maria had gathered to two destinations: the Department of Defense's whistleblower archive and a journalist who had once tried to expose Harrison Defense before her career was quietly buried. Walter knew the cost of what he was doing. It was written in the silence between keystrokes. Behind him, Rex, his loyal German shepherd, lay curled on the worn rug, eyes half closed but alert. The flickering monitor lights shimmered in his deep brown eyes, reflecting both loyalty and unease. Occasionally, the dog's ears twitched at distant thunder. Walter turned briefly, giving the dog a faint smile. "We've been through worse, huh, boy?" Rex responded with a low huff, the kind that meant both agreement and warning. Walter resumed typing, his broad shoulders hunched like armor. The hum of the computer filled the room, accompanied by the faint crackle of the radio on the shelf, an old habit of his, leaving it tuned to a static frequency. He worked in silence for nearly an hour before the first voice broke it. "You're bleeding again," said Maria softly. She stood in the doorway, rain dripping from her jacket, strands of her dark hair plastered against her temples. She looked exhausted but composed, her sharp hazel eyes scanning the room with an engineer's instinct for weak points. "Door was unlocked," she added. "Not smart." "They already know where I live," Walter replied, not turning from the screen. "Locks don't stop what's coming." Maria stepped inside, dropping her satchel onto the table. "Then we need to move the data somewhere safer. You've been on every internal list since the breach." "That's why I'm building the switch," Walter said, his voice calm but heavy. If they shut me down, this thing goes live. Everything hits the federal servers before they can touch it." He paused, then looked up at her. "You trust me, Alvarez?" She gave a humorless smirk. "I trusted the system once. That didn't end well. You? I trust you enough to fight beside you." She crossed her arms, studying the screens. "So, who's the journalist?" Walter tapped a key, pulling up a name: Elena Cortez. "Used to write for the Sentinel, investigative type. Last I heard, she was freelancing out of Denver after her editor got pulled. She covered the Bridge 47 hearings before they buried it." Maria nodded slowly. "She's still on their radar. You're putting her in danger." "We're all in danger," Walter replied. "But she's the only one who ever called it what it was: murder wrapped in paperwork." He leaned back, the leather chair creaking under his weight. His face was drawn and pale, the scar on his jaw catching the light. "This time, I won't let them erase it." Maria watched him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. "You remind me of my father," she said quietly. "He worked in the same line, building things meant to save lives. When he found out they were being weaponized, he quit. 2 months later, his car malfunctioned on the highway." Walter's eyes flickered toward her. "And you still came back to this world?" "Someone has to," she said. "Otherwise, they win." They stood in silence for a while. The computer beeped softly, signaling the completion of a secure upload. Walter inserted a flash drive, encrypted the files, and tucked it into a small waterproof casing. He handed it to Maria. "If I don't check in, you take this to Cortez in person. You tell her everything." Maria took it, her grip firm. "You're talking like you're not coming back." Walter gave a dry chuckle. "I've been gone a long time, Alvarez. I'm just giving the truth a head start." Outside, lightning flashed across the horizon, illuminating the skeletal remains of the tanks. The thunder rolled through the field, shaking the trailer walls. Rex barked once, low and short, then went silent again. Walter stood, wincing as the movement tugged at his shoulder wound. He walked to the window and stared out into the storm. The field shimmered under the rain, metal glinting like bones. "They'll come," Maria said behind him. "You know that." "I'm counting on it," he replied. His voice was steady, almost serene. "That's what the switch is for." As the night deepened, Walter sat back at the desk, the screen reflecting in his eyes, a pale fire in the dark. Rex lay down beside his boots, tail wrapped close. Maria leaned against the wall, silent but watchful. Together they waited, not for rescue, but for the reckoning that was already on its way. The rain had stopped, leaving the Kansas plains heavy with fog and the faint smell of wet earth. Walter Reed sat at his workbench, a cigarette burning low between his fingers, the room thick with the residue of old smoke and tension. The monitors behind him still glowed faintly, lines of code rolling like quiet machinery. Rex slept near the doorway, tail twitching occasionally, his breath deep and steady. Maria had gone into town to secure a second storage drive, leaving Walter alone with the silence that always came before something went wrong. He didn't have to wait long. A black sedan rolled down the gravel path that cut through the boneyard, its polished surface reflecting the pale light like a blade. Walter saw it from the window and exhaled a slow curse. He crushed the cigarette into an ashtray, straightened his back, and waited. The engine cut off. Two men in dark suits stepped out first, tall, anonymous, the kind of men who looked like they'd been born inside boardrooms and trained to frown at empathy. Then the third door opened, and Charles Rudd emerged. Rudd was 50, tall and lean, with silver hair combed immaculately back, skin smooth for his age, and eyes as cold as chrome. He wore a gray suit so sharp it could have drawn blood, and a black tie that reflected no light at all. There was something in his gait, measured, regal, almost predatory. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Men like Rudd didn't arrive. They descended. Walter opened the door before they could knock. "You took a wrong turn," he said flatly. Rudd smiled, though it didn't touch his eyes. "I doubt that." His voice was calm, cultured, the kind that belonged to marble floors and glass towers. "May we come in?" "You already know the answer," Walter said, but stepped aside anyway. Rudd entered, glancing around the dim trailer like a man touring a relic. His bodyguards remained at the threshold. Rex immediately lifted his head, growling low, the fur on his back bristling. "Beautiful animal," Rudd said mildly. "Loyal. Predictable. I like that." "He doesn't like thieves," Walter replied, taking a seat without offering one. Rudd smirked faintly, unbothered. "Then I'll keep my hands visible." He placed a sleek silver briefcase on the table and opened it. Inside, stacks of cash lay neatly wrapped beside a sealed folder. $500,000, Rudd said smoothly, and a lifetime retainer should you decide to work under a private contract. Consultancy, if you prefer. You'll have your reputation restored, your record erased, and your silence well compensated. Walter stared at the money, then at the man. "You came all the way here for that?" "For this," Rudd said, sliding the folder toward him. Inside were photographs. Walter, Maria, the warehouse, the crates, every step of their investigation, documented. "We don't want trouble, Mr. Reed. You were a good soldier, a loyal man. That loyalty can still serve both of us." Walter leaned back, eyes narrowing. "You talk like you know me." "I do," Rudd said softly. "You're a man haunted by failure. I can see it in your posture, your eyes. You blame yourself for what happened, even though you know better. I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to give you peace." Rex growled again, louder this time. Rudd didn't flinch, but his smile thinned. "Tell your dog I mean no harm." Walter's voice dropped an octave. He doesn't believe in that. The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel like gravity. Rudd closed the case slowly. You could walk away, he said, tone still measured. No one would blame you. 10 years of exile. Don't you think you've earned rest? Walter's eyes were gray steel. You want to buy my silence. I'm offering you freedom. Freedom, Walter said, voice turning sharp, isn't for sale. Not from men who buried 23 soldiers and called it acceptable loss. He pushed the case back across the table. I don't want your money, Rudd. I want truth to outlive both of us. For the first time, Rudd's expression cracked. The calm drained from his eyes, replaced by something harder. Irritation, maybe fear. He stood slowly, adjusting his tie. Be careful what you chase, Mr. Reed. Truth has a tendency to bury the ones who dig too deep. Walter smiled thinly. Guess I already live underground. Rudd lingered a moment, then turned toward the door. You're making a mistake. Wouldn't be my first, Walter said. As Rudd stepped outside, Rex followed him to the threshold, teeth bared but silent. The two bodyguards stiffened, but Rudd merely glanced back at the dog. He'll die for you, you know, he said. That's what loyalty is. Suicidal devotion. Walter's reply was quiet but sure. Then maybe it's something you'll never understand. The sedan rolled away. The storm that had been gathering over the Kansas plains finally broke that night. Lightning stitched the sky in jagged seams, thunder rolling like artillery over the horizon. Inside the trailer, Walter Reed sat alone at his desk, watching the lines of code on his monitor pulse in steady rhythm. Every file, every image, every piece of evidence he and Maria had gathered was uploaded and encrypted, the system waiting for its silent order. On the floor, Rex lay curled near the door, ears twitching at every rumble. The dog's amber eyes reflected the glow of the screens. Steady, loyal, unflinching. Walter rubbed at his shoulder, still stiff from the warehouse wound. His body was tired, but his mind burned. He had faced soldiers, storms, and guilt, but not this kind of quiet dread. He could feel it in the air, the calm before violence. Somewhere out in the dark, men like Charles Rudd didn't sleep. They planned. They erased. A faint noise, a soft crunch outside, broke the hum of the rain. Rex's head snapped up, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Walter reached for the handgun he kept under the desk, flicking the safety off. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. The growl deepened. Then came the smell. Acrid, wrong, unmistakable. Gasoline. Walter rose instantly, eyes cutting towards the window. Through the curtains, a thin shimmer of flame crawled up the siding of the trailer like a living vein of light. God damn it! He lunged for the door, but the fire was faster. Within seconds, the lower wall exploded in orange. Heat hit him like a wave. He turned toward the back, shouting, "Rex, out now!" The dog barked once and sprinted toward him, teeth bared against the smoke. Walter grabbed the external hard drive from the desk, shoving it into his jacket pocket. But before he could reach the exit, a beam from the ceiling collapsed, blocking the hallway. The air filled with smoke thick as iron dust. Rex leaped onto the debris, clawing through burning fragments, yelping but refusing to back down. Walter tried to push forward, his breath shallow, but the heat was blinding. Then he felt something tugging his sleeve. Rex, teeth clamped in the fabric, pulling him sideways toward the shattered window. "Go!" Walter coughed, stumbling as the dog dragged him through the gap. The broken glass tore his arm, but the rush of cold rain hit his face like resurrection. They fell hard into the mud outside, both coughing violently. Behind them, the trailer was a torch. Walter rolled onto his side, watching the flames devour everything, the monitors, the workbench, the evidence drives. For a second, He thought of the dead man's switch. Had it activated? He could only hope. A final thunderclap shook the ground, and part of the roof collapsed inward. The fire roared, angry and alive. Rex stood beside him, soaked, his fur singed in places but eyes bright and sharp. The dog barked once, as if calling him back to focus. Walter smiled faintly through the pain. "You saved me again, didn't you, soldier?" He reached out and gripped the dog's neck, his hand trembling. When the fire trucks arrived nearly an hour later, there was nothing left but ash and steam. The local sheriff, Deputy Claymore, a stout man in his 40s with a trimmed beard and skeptical eyes, stood near the ruins, shaking his head. "Poor bastard," he muttered. "House lit up like a flare. Probably an accident." But when he noticed the faint outline of tire tracks in the wet dirt, 2 sets leading away, his expression hardened. Beside them, a single line of paw prints trailed towards the field. Or maybe not. He looked to his deputy. "Get the state office on this." By dawn, the news had already spread. Across national broadcasts, the headlines scrolled in red. "Military contractor under investigation for recycled explosives." Hidden whistleblower data had flooded both the Department of Defense and multiple media outlets overnight, complete with photos, coordinates, and internal memos from Harrison Defense. Reporters scrambled to verify sources, and while no one could confirm where the leak originated, one quote repeated across every screen. "Truth is heavier than steel." On one morning show, Maria Alvarez appeared, her hair tied back, face pale but steady under the studio lights. The host asked if she had known Walter Reed. Maria looked directly into the camera. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't broken. He was the man who carried the weight of 23 lives until he found the truth that killed him. They tried to silence him, but they forgot. Truth has a heartbeat. It moves. Her voice faltered slightly on the last word, but she didn't look away. "He used to say that honesty isn't survival, it's resurrection." The camera zoomed closer, catching the glint of tears she refused to shed. Somewhere far from the noise and the lights, a storm still rolled across the plains. In the blackened field where the trailer once stood, the earth steamed quietly. A charred metal tag, stamped 45A721, lay half buried in the mud. A few feet away, deep paw prints led toward the horizon, vanishing into the mist. The fire had erased a man, but not his message. The courthouse in Washington, D.C., stood under a sky the color of iron, its marble columns streaked with cold rain. Inside courtroom 4B, the air was thick with tension and whispers, as if the very walls knew that justice was being exhumed from beneath layers of lies. For almost a year, this place had become the graveyard of reputations, where men who thought themselves untouchable finally faced their ghosts. At the defense table sat Charles Rudd, 50, tall, hair silver and combed to perfection, his steel-gray suit as sharp as his arrogance. Beside him were 3 other executives, Harold Vance, narrow-eyed and bitter, Elliot Brower, whose nervous fingers never stopped tapping, and Simon Gray, quiet but coiled like a wire. Across from them stood the government's witness, Maria Alvarez, 40, her brown hair tied neatly back, her voice clear but heavy with restraint. Gone was the exhaustion that had haunted her during her days hiding evidence with Walter Reed. Now there was only resolve. She spoke with calm precision, describing how Harrison Defense had recycled faulty military components, Serial 45A, the same design that had killed 23 soldiers in the Bridge 47 collapse. Her testimony painted a portrait of deliberate greed, masked as oversight. The prosecutor, Daniel Mercer, a tall, sharp-featured man with eyes that burned like courtroom spotlights, guided her through the details. "Miss Alvarez," he said, pacing slowly, "did Walter Reed know what these codes meant when he found them?" "He did," she answered. "He knew they were proof that the company had been selling death." At that, Rudd shifted in his seat, jaw tightening. Mercer stepped closer, lowering his tone. "And what did he do with that proof?" Maria looked straight ahead, meeting the jury's eyes. "He gave it to the world." The defense objected, but Judge Eleanor Finch, 62, a woman with silver hair tied in a bun and eyes like polished glass, silenced the courtroom with a single word. "Overruled." Her voice carried the weight of finality. The next few hours unfolded like the peeling of old metal, slow, excruciating, inevitable. Maria described the fire, the digital switch Walter had created, and the data leak that shattered Harrison Defense's facade. When asked about his death, she paused for several seconds before saying softly, "He didn't die in that fire. He became it." The courtroom went silent except for the low hum of fluorescent lights. On the screen behind her appeared a photograph of Walter, eyes steady, face carved by years of wind, smoke, and regret, with the quote that now traveled the world: "Truth is heavier than steel." Veterans in the gallery lowered their heads. Families of the fallen soldiers clutched one another's hands. The trial stretched for months, every headline dissecting the corporate rot that had masqueraded as patriotism. In the end, the verdict came down like a hammer. Guilty. Charles Rudd and his executives were sentenced to decades in prison. The empire of false safety they had built was torn apart, one lie at a time. When the verdict was read, Rudd simply stared at the floor, his polished shoes reflecting the dull light of his downfall. After the trial, Maria returned to Kansas to finalize Walter's estate. The field had grown wild again, grass reclaiming the scars of fire. The air smelled faintly of rust and summer storms. As she walked through the remains, she spotted movement among the weeds, a familiar silhouette rising from the hill's edge. Rex, the old German shepherd, thinner now, his fur faded to ash gray, limped toward her. His eyes, still golden and alive, fixed on her with recognition that transcended language. Maria dropped to her knees, tears breaking silently as Rex pressed his head against her chest. Around his neck hung the same scorched collar, Rex, property of W. Reed. She whispered, "Hey, soldier, you found your way home." From that day, Rex stayed with her. When she gave lectures on engineering ethics, he lay quietly beside the podium. When trains passed in the distance, their horns echoing across the fields, Rex would rise, ears perked, and turn west toward Kansas, the direction of the rusted horizon where his master's ghost still lingered. In those moments, Maria swore she could almost see Walter standing there too, watching the world he'd redeemed with truth and fire. 5 years later, the Kansas plains had changed. The field where rust once reigned was no longer a graveyard of forgotten machines, but a cradle of rebirth. Rising from the same soil where Walter Reed's trailer had burned, now stood the Rex Technical Academy, a gleaming complex of glass and steel designed for one purpose: to teach young engineers the cost of truth. The building was modest compared to the skyscrapers of industry, but its foundation was sacred. The air still smelled faintly of iron and rain, as if the land itself remembered what had been sacrificed here. At the academy's entrance stood a bronze monument, Walter Reed in his old army jacket, head slightly bowed, one hand resting on the shoulder of his loyal German shepherd, Rex. The sculptor, a young woman named Lydia Mercer, daughter of the late prosecutor Daniel Mercer, had carved it with striking realism. The weathered lines on Walter's face, the softness of Rex's fur, the way both gazed toward the horizon as if waiting for one last signal from the past. Beneath the statue, etched in clean brass, were the words, They forged truth in the ruins of lies. Every morning, when the sun crested over the horizon, the light touched that inscription first, before spilling across the courtyard where dozens of students in gray work uniforms tested real machinery. Motors, signal relays, safety valves, and flotation devices designed to prevent the kind of failures that had once taken 23 lives. They were not just learning engineering. They were inheriting a moral compass. Instructors reminded them often of Walter's story, not as a tragedy, but as a compass for conscience. One such instructor was Maria Alvarez, now 45, her hair streaked with silver, but her eyes still sharp and kind. She wore a white engineer's coat and a lanyard that read, Director of Applied Ethics. Every day she walked the training yard with Rex trotting beside her. Older now, slower, his fur mostly gray, his gait uneven but proud. Students often stopped to pet him, whispering as if he were living history. Maria never corrected them. He is, she would say quietly. He's the last witness. In the workshop's main hall hung a large mural, a depiction of the iron field as it once was. Broken tanks, twisted beams, storms of rust. In the center, painted with almost holy reverence, stood Walter and Rex beneath a bleeding sunset. It wasn't painted by any professional artist, but by a group of graduating students who had found inspiration in the files Walter had left behind. The letters, the diagrams, the words, "Truth is heavier than steel." That phrase had become the school's motto, engraved on every student's badge and every classroom door. On the 5th anniversary of the Academy's founding, the school held a memorial at sunset. The courtyard filled with students, veterans, and families of the fallen soldiers. The brass band played softly, the sound of the trumpet echoing across Oe-Su, the plains. Maria stood at the podium, holding a single folded paper, the same copy of Walter's words she had once read before Congress. Truth does not die in fire. It becomes light. Her voice wavered as she spoke. We live in that light now, and as long as one of you carries it forward, the iron field will never die again. When the ceremony ended, the students placed small mechanical SOS beacons across the yard, each one handmade, each one blinking faintly in rhythm. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. But tonight, the signal was not a cry for help. It was a hymn of remembrance. As dusk deepened, the sound of the wind moved through the Academy's metal walls, carrying the faint echo of that signal into the open plains. Some swore they could hear it whispering through the grass. Soft, rhythmic, eternal. Maria stayed until the last light faded. Rex sat beside her, his muzzle resting on her shoe, eyes half closed. When a freight train passed in the distance, its whistle cutting the night air, the old dog stirred, lifting his head to face west one final time. Maria smiled through her tears. He's still calling, she whispered. And we're still answering. The stars blinked awake over Kansas, and for a fleeting moment, the Academy's lights mirrored them perfectly, tiny signals shining in the dark, reminders that truth, once found, can never be silenced again. In the end, the iron field was never just a story about rust or war or broken machines. It was about resurrection. Out of lies came truth. Out of ashes came grace. And when the Kansas wind hums across that reborn Academy, some say you can still hear the faint rhythm of an SOS. But it's not a cry for help anymore. It's God whispering through the wind, reminding us that even in the ruins, He can forge something holy. Walter Reed's journey was not one of loss, but of redemption. He proved that the greatest miracles don't come as thunder or light. They come quietly, through honesty, loyalty, and the courage to do what's right when no one is watching. In our daily lives, each of us walks our own iron field. We face choices, to give up or to rebuild, to stay silent, or to speak the truth. And when we choose truth, even in small ways, we honor the divine spark that still moves among us. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes in second chances. Leave a comment telling us what faith and loyalty mean to you. Subscribe to follow more stories of redemption, mercy, and grace. And may God bless you, your family, and every soul still listening for the sound of hope in the wind.